This is StoryBeat, Storytellers on Storytelling, an exploration into how master storytellers and artists develop and build brilliant stories and works of art that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators of all kinds find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University in the heart of downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. Well, my guest today, Christy Marx, has had an eclectic career as a transmedia writer, TV and animation series developer, game designer, and narrative designer. She's written live-action television, film, animation, video games, comic books, graphic novels, manga, and nonfiction educational books. Christy began her game design career creating award-winning adventure games for Sierra Online and went on to work on console, MMO, Facebook, and mobile games. Christy was awarded the Writers Guild of America Animation Writers Caucus Award for contributions to the field of animation writing. Her TV credits include Babylon 5, Twilight Zone, Spider-Man, G.I. Joe, Jem and the Holograms, ReBoot, Conan, Beast Wars, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. With her partner Randy Littlejohn, she's written for X-Men Evolution, Stargate Infinity, He-Man, and others. She began writing comics with Conan and Red Sonja stories for Marvel. Her credits include Wolfrider, a graphic novel with my very first StoryBeat guest, Wendy Pini, in her Elfquest series. She's written for DC Comics on Amethyst, Birds of Prey, and Green Arrow. For Marvel Epic, she created the series The Sisterhood of Steel about a society of warrior women. After 6 years providing narrative design at Zynga, she's returned to the freelance life to pursue her own projects, including a second edition of her book, Writing for Animation, Comics, and Games, which, by the way, our screenwriters here at Point Park University use. And she's also written a memoir about creating the animation series Jem and the Holograms. For all those reasons, and many more, it's truly a great honor and a real pleasure for me to have my friend Christy Marx join me on StoryBeat today. Christy, welcome to the show.
Hey, Steve. Really good to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. So let's go all the way back in time. Let's go back into your history a bit. Where did all of this storytelling begin? When did you think of yourself as someone who can write stories?
The storytelling actually began very, very early, but realizing that I was a writer actually came much, much later. I mean, even when I was a little kid and I became obsessed with comics, I was trying to write and draw my own sequential stories. And I had a mother who was sort of a frustrated artist. You know, she liked to paint and do art, and so she pushed me in the art direction. And so I mistakenly tried to go down the art path for way too long because I'm not an artist. I'm very visually oriented and color oriented. I love colors and so forth. But I really did not have the necessary skills to be an artist, and I didn't quite discover that until I was about 19, 20 years old, and I'd moved to Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And I put together a portfolio, and I went around like showing this portfolio of this awful art. and someone did me what was actually a tremendous favor at the time. I went to, I think it was, I don't know, it was an advertising agency or what it was, but I went and showed it to some woman who looked at me and she said, "This is terrible." And she made me realize, she was the first person to make me realize that I was a storyteller but not an artist.
Not an artist.
And so at that point, I realized I should be writing, and I was, well along. It took me years to really kind of get my act together and realize that I was a writer and to start seriously focusing on writing.
But you were writing what you were drawing, so you were already doing that, yes?
Oh, yeah. By the time I was a young teenager, I had created, I think, well, dozens of female characters,
Wow.
female hero characters. Humorously enough, the very first superhero female character I created I called her the Black Diamond.
Huh.
And I believe some years ago, someone actually came out with a character called Black Diamond. I believe I never actually did anything beyond the development work I did on it as a kid. But yeah, I was frustrated because I loved comics. I read comics from an early age and I've collected comics and loved comics my whole life. But I was always frustrated by the lack of really good female role models in the comics. In fact, as I've related in other interviews, I would take a ballpoint pen and turn Robin into a girl or turn Aqualad into a girl in my comics, in the comics that I bought.
So you were into superheroes even at a very early age?
Oh, yeah, I wanted to grow up to be Batman, and then I discovered I couldn't do gymnastics.
That's a prohibitive problem.
Yeah. I even went to the point of getting a book out of the library called The G-Men, because it was about being a criminologist.
Yes.
And of course, the title kind of tells you everything. It was all men,
yes.
Male oriented. There was no inkling that a woman could do something like this.
Well, I'm not going to do anything to try and give away your age, but you were doing this in a time sort of prior to women being known for working on superhero anything, correct?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, obviously there were women doing it, but pretty much nobody knew about them.
Well, it still was kind of an unknown thing, but I think you're probably pretty rare, you and Wendy and folks like you, women like you, it's pretty rare for you to have come up thinking that you could even try to do something like that because it was so male-dominated then. Am I right?
Oh, yeah. When I was about 12 or 13, I actually wrote a letter to DC Comics saying that I wanted to work in comics.
Right.
And, wanting to know about how to work in comics. And I got a personalized letter back, which was very cool. And they sent me this little booklet called Americana in 4 Colors. I don't know if you've ever seen this
No.
thing, but it's a wonderful, delightful little booklet. Had art by Dan DeCarlo in it. And it was like a how-to primer on how to make comics. But the telling point was that in the letter back, they said, "Dear Mr. Marx." So even though my name was Christy Marx, and that was how I wrote, the assumption was that a boy had written.
Sure. Well,
so I mean there's the clue.
Well, there are certainly well-known males named Christy, so they jumped to a conclusion.
That never occurred to me as a kid that there was a boy with a name Christy.
Sure, of course, of course. And did you then respond back to them?
No.
You let that go. So all right. So you were into superheroes. Were you reading comic books as a young person?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
What were your favorites? Batman, obviously. What else?
Yeah, well, I started out reading almost all DC comics. So I was really into Batman and Superman and action and Legion of Superheroes and Metal Men and Lois Lane was a big one. I just adored Lois Lane.
Mm-hmm.
Jimmy Olsen, World's Finest. All those kind of books. And but I was also reading some Archie, and I really liked Dan DeCarlo's art.
Right.
I loved his work, and I would trace it. I would put tracing paper over it and trace it and try to learn to draw from that.
But
there's a clue why I'm not an artist, but anyway.
And years later discovered that wasn't working so well.
Yeah, exactly. So I was really into it, and then finally I discovered when Marvel began publishing like Fantastic Four and Spider-Man and Doctor Strange and Thor, and then I discovered all the Marvels and became a complete Marvel fanatic,
mm-hmm.
and really went at it with Marvel. One fun thing, one revelation that I just had very recently and it's interesting. It's also circular. The person who gave me my break in comics was Roy Thomas. And so Roy and I have been, friends ever since. Terrific guy. And the first comic book I ever read, what just scared the shit out of me, and it was about an indestructible robot. And it was just the story I read as a very little kid, and it was at one of my grandparents' house. It really, really scared me. And then I went back trying to get the comic again, and my grandparents had thrown it out. So I was never able to figure out what this comic was. And I tried for decades to find out what this comic was. Well, I read an article that Roy wrote about the comic that inspired him to create Ultron.
Right.
And it was the same story, because he described the story, and I'm going, that's the story. And it turned out to be a Captain Video comic. And so Roy and I were both inspired or moved or affected by this same story. And thanks to Roy, decades later, I finally found out what it was, and it turned out to be the inspiration for Ultron. So I just thought that was like a wonderful bit of circular nonsense.
That is circular. Have you been able to get a hold of a copy of it?
He sent me one.
And was it everything you remember, or how had your perspective on it changed?
Oh, it was like nothing like what I'd remembered. I had created a story in my head that was far more awesome than what I actually saw when I saw it again as an adult.
Isn't that the way?
There was one panel in particular that just had the most amazing impact in my head, and then when I saw it again, it was like, that's it? That was the panel? That I mean, it was just amazing.
It's astonishing what a young and sort of inexperienced mind will perceive as being much fuller and bigger than what an experienced mind sees. I see that all the time.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
I see that in my students a lot, where they're expressing something that to them is gigantic, and to me, I'm going, well, you can go much bigger than that, and that's really true for you're saying it. It's the same thing when movies that we watch as kids, and they have some massive impact on us. You see it as an adult, and you go, what was that all about?
Yeah, I'm afraid so. I mean, if I go back and I would pull out maybe and look at one of these old DC comics that I still had. It's old and battered, and I read it 1,000 times as a child. And those stories those DC stories from the '60s were really silly. They were just silly and out there and ridiculous, and you just didn't care as a kid because they were so wonderful anyway. But
let's explore that for a moment. How do you think that those silly, sort of probably fairly thin stories from when you were a kid, how do you think that they have informed your career?
I try to do a lot better than that. I try to make sure that my stories make sense and have an inner cohesion and an inner logic, that they're not written down to kids if I'm writing for kids. Like if I'm doing animation for 8 to 12, I never want to write down to the audience. I always want... I mean, if I can give you an example, I had a meeting with a producer, and he had already created one series that was kind of silly, off the wall, but that's okay. It was sort of satiric and silly and off the wall. And in fact, Randy and I actually ended up writing for it at one point. But he had gotten the rights to the title of War of the Worlds, the title, not the story,
right?
Not the book, the title. And so he was creating something brand new, just using that title. And he kept throwing out these ideas for, it was like space wars and aliens and all this stuff. And he would throw out these ideas, and I would go, well, that won't work because the sun is a sphere; it's not a flat disk. And he would keep throwing out these really stupid ideas, and I would keep saying, well, yeah, but that physically doesn't make sense because this or this. And finally, he just got so exasperated. He said, "Kids don't care about science."
Oh.
And I'm thinking, that's everything that I hate in attitudes towards kids.
Well, sure.
Right there.
Well, sure.
And I obviously did not end up working on this project because I think I would have just kicked the guy in the shins too many times. But that's what drives me crazy. And I ran into that attitude, more than once, obviously, and I ran into it a little bit, and people that were working on GEM who wanted to just completely ignore reality, any even remote sense of reality, like with holograms, what holograms could do. I tried to actually bring a tiny bit of science to it, and not just completely, but it got just ignored or thrown out the window. But
sure.
Personally, to me, that's important because what separates, I won't say science fiction as much, although science fiction to me is a separate category from what a lot of people are calling science fiction, which is more like space opera or techno fantasy or whatever. And any other form of fantasy is it has to have its own consistent inner rules of logic.
100%.
You must adhere to them.
100%.
That's why Harry Potter doesn't break out, a machine gun instead of a wand.
Yes.
Or why James Bond doesn't suddenly start casting spells. I mean, you determine what the rules of your fantasy are, and they can be any rules. I mean, that you're the one making them up, so you can determine the direction you want to go in or how far out you want to get. But you have to have at least some set of logic rules and then follow them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what will really differentiate any form of good fantasy from bad fantasy.
Absolutely.
That in games, too. When Randy and I were working on an MMO it was supposed to be for 8 to 12-year-olds. We're working on this huge MMO project. And I would keep running into that with the artists who would say, it's fantasy, we can do anything. And I'm like, no, you still have to have some set of rules. It has to make some kind of sense.
Absolutely.
I encountered that all over the place.
I teach in my classes that I call it the sandbox. I don't know if anybody else does, but it's like when you're a kid and you're playing in a sandbox. You can do anything that you want within the walls of that sandbox, but as soon as you go outside of it, everything changes. It turns into grass or concrete or whatever. And it's that way for me in storytelling, is that here's the sandbox, you create it, but you have to stay within that sandbox, but you can go anywhere you want inside of it. That makes sense?
Yeah, that does make a certain amount of sense, but you still need to have certain rules even within your sandbox.
Of course.
That to make it's funny. I'm rereading Calvin and Hobbes, and I was just read one of the Calvin and Hobbes strips where Calvin's playing in the sandbox and he builds the city and then he stomps on it, goes, Godzilla,
All right, so what was it, when was it, and what was it that you finally said to yourself in your early years, I want to do this for a living. I want to become a professional at this. What was it that happened?
Good question. I don't know if I could pinpoint any particular moment, but one big thing was that I moved from Illinois, where I grew up. I moved to L.A.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking massive culture shock.
Yeah.
And, exposure to just a whole new world of every kind. I did not know what I wanted to do. I was at the University of Illinois in liberal arts, but I abandoned that to move to L.A. and really had no idea what I wanted to do with myself. And
well, why L.A.? What attracted you to L.A.?
Oh, God.
A boy?
I'm going to have to admit something here. Okay. So I fell in love with a guy who was into Scientology.
Okay.
And he wanted to do, I ended up getting into it as well because of him. And in order to do the higher levels of Scientology, you had to come to L.A.
Ah.
Because that's where all the higher level of training of Scientology
right.
at the time, and still is, I think.
And
so that was actually what brought us to L.A. And then once we got to L.A., and I didn't know what to do with myself, but it got to the point where I had to have a job, and by just weird circumstances, I ended up working in the life insurance business, and I ended up eventually as a special risk underwriter, meaning I was someone who read medical reports and had to figure out whether these really sick people could get insurance or not.
Right. Gee.
And throughout all of that, though, I was starting to kind of meet people who were interested in comics, and I was writing, writing short stories and submitting them, which I didn't sell any, but I was at least trying to do something. And I went to the Sherwood Oaks Experimental College, which was a wonderful place that opened up on the second floor of over a storefront in Hollywood Boulevard, and they would bring in working professionals, people, directors and writers and producers who were actually doing it, the working people, and they would bring them in to teach these classes. And so I started studying screenwriting, and I just was slowly kind of making my way through the labyrinth of what this whole entertainment world was. And I knew I had to get out of life insurance. I just could not spend the rest of my life reading these medical reports and doing this awful job. And so I just started sending out resumes and applying for work, and eventually got a job working for Tom Laughlin, who made the Billy Jack movie.
Right.
So that was my first job within production.
What were you doing?
So that was my shift into the entertainment business. So that was happening on the one side in terms of trying to earn a living and learn about the business. And then on the other side, I was still writing things and, trying to make my way and meeting people who were into comics. And then Roy Thomas moved to L.A., and he spoke at a gathering. And so I went to this gathering and asked him if there was some way that I could write for any of the comics he was doing, and he said that he would be interested in a Conan story that was told from the woman's point of view. So I went off and wrote one and gave it to him, and that was my first sale.
Wow. That's an impressive first sale.
So that was starting. So I was starting to break in a little bit to comics writing, and because I was making all of these connections with people in this group called the Comic Art Professional Society, CAPS. Someone said to me one day, Don Glut, in fact, said to me, "Oh, there's this animation studio, DePatie Freeling, and they're making a Fantastic Four animation series, and they're looking for people who have written a Fantastic Four." And I had worked with a couple of people to sort of write out the beats for a what if the Fantastic Four had different powers, and Roy used that. And so on the slim basis of that credit, I called up, I just cold called, and I got a meeting with David DePatie.
Yeah.
And I sat down across the desk from him, and he said, "Have you ever written animation?" And I said, "No." And so he slid a script across the desk to me to use as a template, and hired me to write one of these stories. So, it was just a matter of circumstance and luck and networking and meeting people at the right time, but also it was a matter of I was doing the work. I was writing scripts, I was writing stories, I was doing it, on my own. So I wasn't just trying to come in completely cold.
No, you had been in your own form of training for some time at that point.
Yeah, and taking courses and all that stuff.
But you have no formal degree in it. You didn't go to school for it, correct?
Correct.
And so it's just the school of hard knocks and just making it happen by doing it. I sometimes think that's the ideal way to do it.
It could be ideal. I think it helps that I am a voracious reader, and all my life, from the very earliest age, I just had my nose on a book and was reading and reading and reading and reading. So, I sort of living and breathing storytelling my entire life.
Would you call that the singular thing that has helped you to develop your talent more than any other?
it's certainly vitally important.
Obviously, you have to write. You got to write and write and write as you did. But then there's these other factors, whether it's working somewhere or whether it's being a reader or something like that. It sounds to me like you've exposed yourself to so many stories that they've just sort of sunk in.
Yeah, and all different kinds of stories. I mean, obviously, reading comic books is one form of storytelling versus reading novels, which is another very different form of
for
storytelling.
sure.
Versus movies and TV, and whatever. And they're all different forms of storytelling, but they're all the same essential form of storytelling too. But there's visuals. I think of it as visual storytelling. What I really fell into, because writing, like the book you mentioned, writing for animation, comics, and games. These are all visual storytelling.
Absolutely.
Media, and so I love novels and books, and I want to actually get some written here one of these days. But the visual storytelling is also its own very special kind of a skill.
It's what people don't quite understand when they haven't done it, that it is a specific skill set, and it shares lots of things in common with being a novelist or short story writer, but there are significant differences too. And
yeah, because in a novel you can apply yourself to all of the senses and beyond.
Yes.
And be deep inside someone's mind at all times if you want to. But with visual storytelling, you in animation and games, you really can only do it by sight and sound.
Yeah, two
That's
senses.
That's what you got to work with. In comics, it's just by sight. So you really have to gear the storytelling to work with those senses.
Well, I think that what we're finding out in the world of Hollywood is that that visual storytelling of comics has somehow translated in a massive way to the screen. And that's true with the Marvel Cinematic Universe and what Warner Brothers and DC try to do, although I don't think they've been anywhere near as successful as Marvel. But yeah, it's really it's a completely visual medium. It's of the eyes versus of the mind. And there's a huge difference.
And so you have to be able to convey all the things that you would convey perhaps through inner storytelling with a book has to be completely external storytelling, because if they can't see it on the screen or hear it, they're not going to know it.
Absolutely correct. And try to convince that of my screenwriting students all the time.
That's just what it is.
Every time I have a student that writes in a script, Bob realizes Janet isn't taking a shine to him, and I say, how does the audience know what Bob's realizing? It's not internal. You have to see it.
Yeah.
Or hear it, one of those two, as you say. I love that you describe yourself as a transmedia writer. I've been doing this a while, and I've never had anyone use that word in a description of themselves in a bio. So tell us what a transmedia, at least your definition of it, what's a transmedia writer?
Someone who knows how to cross between different forms of media, such as animation or live action and comics or games, what have you. I mean, I've done lots and lots of development of toys into animation series, or in the case of Bucky O'Hare, it was Neil Adams had the comic book, and I had to translate that into animation series. So you can cross over between turning games into comics or comics into games or animation into games or whatever, but you need to understand how each different medium works and how storytelling in each medium works in order to be able to cross over between them.
Now, you're not talking about just genre, understanding genre. You're talking about the actual the differences between one discipline from another, correct?
Correct, yeah, and how to apply one form of storytelling to another medium.
So, so how did you wind up developing games? How did that happen?
Well, let's see. We had an absolutely devastating writer's strike back in about 1988.
88 is exactly right.
And at the same time, all of my other areas of writing just imploded. There was no animation work, and there wasn't any comics work. I mean, it was just really a bad cycle of nothing happening. And just out of the blue, got a phone call from a headhunter who was looking for artists to work for a computer company called Sierra Online.
Right.
And I was at the time married to Peter Ledger, an Australian artist. And they somehow, I don't know how, got his name and his phone number. And me being who I am, I never pass up an opportunity. And I said, oh, are they looking for writers too? And the guy said, well, I'll ask. And as it so happened, this was so early in the development of computer games. Sierra Online was like one of the very first, if not the very first.
Way back.
Doing these adventure games. And they were really thrilled at the idea of having a, quote, Hollywood writer, unquote, plus an artist, a writer-artist team. And so we drove up there and just made a deal on the spot to move to Oakhurst, which is up by Yosemite.
Right.
And go to work for Sierra Online and, creating computer games. And I didn't know anything about computer games. I mean, I had played maybe one computer game called Cosmic Ozmo, which was made for the early Mac, Apple, whatever it was. But, yeah, I didn't know anything about creating computer games. But, we were going broke. We were going to lose the house.
Right.
And we desperately needed an opportunity. And here was an amazing opportunity to learn something brand new. And so I just grabbed it. And so we moved up there, and I had to teach myself how to design computer games.
And how did one do that? There were no books on it, were there?
No, no courses, no books, no nothing.
So how'd you do it?
I did it by applying my very logical approach to things, which is I sat down and played every single computer game they had ever made, and played it and studied it and tried to get into the mindset of the player, what players would expect and how it worked for players. I went around to the programmers and I said, tell me what the parameters are, what we can do and can't do with the tech. Explain to me what we can and can't do. I went around to the artists. I said, show me your tools. Tell me what we can and can't do. And I just went around to everybody, and then I went around to the other designers, and I said, may I take a look at what your design documents, your designs, how do you do your designs? What does it look like? And they very, very good people. They very kindly gave me their documentation. And what I discovered is that there was absolutely no set way to do this. I mean, everybody had a completely different approach to designing a game. There was like no standardization whatsoever.
Right.
But by the end of this whole process, I knew exactly, what kind of assets the artist would need, or the musician would need, or the programmers would need, and I badgered the programmers until they told me what kind of a format that I could write in that would be the most useful for them. Because they would just say, oh, don't worry about it, just write any way you want. I'm like, no, there must be a way that would help you. And they, if you wrote it like this, I said, great. So, I figured out a format that worked well for the programmers. And I just worked this all out just by talking to people and learning as much as I could possibly learn. And, of course, by playing games, I also learned what not to do, because as a player, you come across something, you go, oh, God, I will never do that to the player as a designer ever, because that's just terrible. And at the end of all of this, I basically invented the first design document, and because I wrote up the entire, then of course I had to do all my research because I was doing a King Arthur game. So I did extensive research into King Arthur and the Arthurian legends and all of that, because that's a part of my process is research. I'm very, very much into research.
Okay.
So I did a whole ton of research, worked out my story, worked out my puzzles, and all that kind of good stuff. Then I worked out maps. I did these crude maps, and I mapped out the whole game, and I wrote up all of the art assets we need, all the kind of sound assets we need, just whole detailed design document, put it in a 3-ring binder, and then plunked it down on the desk and said, okay, there it is. There's the game design. And they had never seen anything like this before.
Well, you were making it up. Nobody'd ever done it before.
Yeah. So it was, but to me, it was just a logical process. You know, you do your research, you find out what you need to know, you talk to people, you find out what the parameters are, and then you go and you work within those parameters.
Was most of it if this happens, then that happens?
Yeah, there's a lot of that, obviously. They had their own game engine, and the very first game, the King Arthur game, was parser-based. So
I don't know what parser-based means.
That means it was all done by text. You didn't have a mouse to use.
I see.
And the game only had 16 colors. I mean, we're talking
crude, really crude.
You know, the early days of computer games. So basically, the player could move the character around using keyboard keys, and then if they tapped on something, then they would type in what they wanted to know. They would type in a question, or they would type in a comment. And so basically I had to anticipate every single possibility. And I thought of it as like, you know, the rock through wet paper bags kind of a thing. So like, you know, you go from specific to general. So you have specific responses to specific types of questions you know they're going to ask. And then you have, like, you know, broader kind of generalities. And then finally, at the bottom level, if you have absolutely no idea what else to say, you have some kind of a generic response. And you try to anticipate people, you know, typing in all kinds of swear words and curse words and, you know, saying all kinds of really bizarre things and have funny answers for those kind of things. So that was the first game. And it was only the second game where we actually had the mouse had become a thing, and so they became point-and-click games at that point, and then it was a different sort of if-then situation, because then it was like, you know, okay, so if they click on this once, what happens? If they click on it 2 times, what happens? I mean, it's the same basic thing, but, you know, one had to be written for text responses, and then one had to be written just purely for clicks, so the mouse clicks.
And that eventually developed into, it took some time for that to develop into the way things are today. Right? The controllers are totally different from then. I mean, totally different.
Oh, yeah, and then you have, you know, consoles and controllers that all came along later, yeah. You're still designing games when you can, right? Well, not anymore, not at the moment anyway. I worked at Zynga for 6 years, and that was where I learned about mobile games. When I started there, they were just doing Facebook games, and then they got into mobile games. So then I learned about working on mobile games, and I sort of worked a little bit as a game designer on those, but I was mostly working as a narrative designer, so I was more concerned just with trying to get story and good writing into the games.
And would you say that over the years that storytelling has become a better used thing, for lack of a better word, in games?
It's gotten better. There was a long period of time where story was literally sometimes an afterthought. I mean, I got hired on one console game after they had actually created all of the art assets. They had created the entire world. They created all of these characters and different races. They had created all of this. They had all the art done, and they were working on their combat stuff. And they suddenly went, "Oh, we don't have a story." So I got brought in to create, after the fact, a story that somehow explained this floating chunk of world with all these different races on it and how it could exist and what the story was for them all and all of that kind of good stuff. So for a very long period of time, stories definitely were second-class or third-class citizens in the game design process. But that has gotten better. That has definitely gotten better, and there's much more awareness of story being important in making games, at least in terms of console games and bigger type of games, not so much in mobile games.
Can you draw a link between the increase in storytelling in games and the increased popularity of games? Is there a link?
I don't know that how I would do that exactly, no, not really.
Well,
but there are people that are studying it, and they probably have a better idea of that. But I mean, certainly it got to the point where people were saying they wanted to have good story in games.
Well, because there was
paying more attention.
There's only so many times you can go down an alley and either kill somebody or be killed, and you want some kind of a story, right?
Yeah. Plus there's a whole new genre out there which are being called games, and they're not. They're not really games per se. But there is now a whole category genre called episode or choices, which are just purely story-based
experiences,
branching storytelling, basically. Right. But they haven't really gotten the branching storytelling quite right just yet. Hopefully they'll get there. But it's the storytelling comes first, and the game elements are secondary to the storytelling, which is the opposite of pretty much any other game, where gameplay comes first and storytelling is usually the second.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's talk for a moment about Gem, because I know you were intimately involved in that show. How did Gem come about?
Gem came about because I was writing G.I. Joe for Sunbow Productions.
Right.
And they were crazy about the G.I. Joe scripts. They absolutely loved it. Steve Gerber was my story editor on those, and he just absolutely loved what I did, and people at Sunbow loved what I did. And so I had done 5 episodes for that, and they offered me a chance to develop this new series that they had just made a deal with Hasbro to do. And I remember thinking, oh, wow, girl thing, it's so soft. I was writing G.I. Joe, that's what I really liked writing. So I was thinking, I don't know if I'm going to be any good at doing this stuff. But turned out that I really love doing it.
I don't remember. Were the toys in existence at that point, or were they just bringing those out?
Yeah, they had prototypes. They were developing the line of dolls, and
so they weren't out in the world.
Yeah, it wasn't out on the market yet. And so that's why they were trying to get the animation series done to come out at the same time.
Let's talk about the challenges of developing a show that has an existing product to it, where you must conform and work with the manufacturer in order to satisfy their needs to sell that product. What are the challenges in doing that?
I think the misunderstanding is that it's not a toy company sitting there dictating to you what you have to do. There's almost always, in every case that I can think of, you're working with a production company, a production entity, and they are the ones that interface with the toy company.
Right.
So basically, I mean, there's a little bit more of a crossover, because when I did Conan, Hasbro flew me out so they could show me the whole toy line and all that kind of good stuff. And that was a weird case where they didn't even have character names for all of the other characters yet, and I ended up naming some of them that became the product names.
Wow.
Was a first. That doesn't usually happen. With Gem, they kept changing. They didn't even have the product name settled. I'm trying to develop this animation series, and they kept changing the product name. I mean, the character name, product character name. I gave them, full character names. But I think the only person who didn't change name was Pizzazz and Rio. Every other character, including Gem. Gem was originally just called M. The letter M. And then they decided, we can't just use the letter M. There's, trademark and copyright problems with that. And she became Gem. And so she started out named Misty, and then Morgan, and then she became Jerica, and then all these other, and they kept changing the character names, and they kept changing who was playing what instrument, and
wow.
And so that made me a little bit crazy. And also I had to beg and beg and beg and beg for them to show me what the dolls looked like. So because I'm visual, and I'm writing something visual, and so, give me something visual to work with. And so I finally did get some Polaroids of the prototype dolls so that I could at least get some sense of what I was looking at. And then of course, they started producing model sheets and artwork for the series, and that
right.
helped a lot too. But it's the real challenge was just getting them to settle down on who was who and what instruments they were playing, at least in terms of gem. And they had very little interference, I would say, or input. Everyone pretty much liked what I came up with, and in terms of storytelling, I was able to do just about any story I wanted to do, with the exception of there was one story I wanted to do about a kid dealing with an alcoholic father, and they wanted me to water it down so much it wouldn't have been worth doing, so I gave up on it. But other than that, they were actually very much hands off, and it was really just Sunbow that I was dealing with.
And how many episodes of that did you write?
22 or 23,
wow.
Something like that.
Wow.
Out of the 65, yeah. One of which I co-wrote with Ellen Guan, who went on to become one of my best friends ever in life.
Well, that's nice. That's always nice when that happens, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
It is, at the end of the day, a business about people who know people. Your talent is your talent, but it's kind of meaningless unless you're connected in some way to lots of different people.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The Sunbow people were just wonderful. They were definitely some of the best people I've ever worked with. They were so good to me and so good to writers, and they were just such a joy to work with. And there was such an amazing conglomeration of talent that came together for Gem, from the music side and the art side, just the voice talent side, just everything, the writers, everybody,
All right, so this is, to me, this is important and doesn't get discussed enough. What is it that made them so special? What can you define it? Because I'm assuming that in your career you've had more than one experience that wasn't so happy or pleasant. What was it that made this so special?
Really good people. I mean, good talent, good management. The management were open to creativity and really nice people and treated you well. I mean, like when my computer crapped out, they bought me a new computer.
Nice.
They took care of people, and it was just I think it was just the perfect storm of all this talent coming together under the heading of a bunch of really good people that treated them well.
Mm-hmm. So there wasn't one specific thing you could put your finger on, like they served great lunch. It wasn't anything like that. It was just this total package. And without naming names, have you had experiences that counter that by 180 degrees?
Oh, yeah.
And so what did they, again, without naming names, what did they do differently? Were they just mean-spirited and unhelpful, or was there something else?
Yeah, I was actually, there was a story I was going to tell. I was kind of sort of saving it for the end of the podcast.
We'll save it.
Okay.
But so if you were involved in developing a story, how many different shows have you developed over time?
I'd have to go back and look.
It's a bunch, right?
Because not everything got made. So there was a lot of development that I did that never actually got off the ground.
That's the nature of the beast. But it's a lot of product. It's not just one or two things. It's a bunch of stuff, right?
Yeah.
All right. So in your world of development, what is it that makes, if you can put your finger on it, because maybe it's not definable, what is it that makes one show a little more likely to develop easily and well, and what is it that stops other shows from not? What are those experiences like?
Interestingly, I think it comes down to the people who are in control, whoever that is, whoever, producer or, whoever has say over how people are treated, how people are hired, how people are used. Those people determine whether it's going to be a good project or a bad project. If they treat people well, they treat people with respect, they pay people well, you're going to get good results. On Conan, I'll give an example. Conan was another 65 half hour. It started out as a Sunbow show. The first 13 episodes were Sunbow, and then the rest of the episodes got made by a different co-production company, a French co-production company.
Right.
And the person who was running that was getting enormous kickbacks from the French government.
Ugh.
And because he was getting all of these kickbacks from the French government, he had to have his name as the writer on every single episode.
I know this story.
You know, the story, yeah. And so consequently, and I was hired to do all the development, which I did, and I was hired to do all of the story editing, like on all 65, which was grueling, but I did it.
That's grueling, is right.
And I had to hire people who were willing to work under those circumstances of, you know, you're going to have an adapted by credit rather than a written by credit, you know, and you're going to get paid X amount of money, you know, and this is the circumstance. You'll get to do a lot of episodes. I mean, if you're willing to work under those circumstances, then, you know, that's and so people who were willing to do that did that, knowing they were going to get paid a certain amount of money. And then this producer comes, the American and producer comes to me, goes, "Oh, well, listen, we don't want to pay the writers X amount. We want to pay them this amount." And I said, "You got to be kidding me." I mean, I didn't even think about it. I didn't even give it a second thought. I just said, "You got to be kidding me. You're asking these people to take no credit, and now you want to screw them out of more money? Are you kidding? Forget it." And I was ready to just walk away, and so they backed off. But if I hadn't taken that stance, they would have just screwed the writers even further. And so
unreal.
That's the bad experience. You know, those are the people that don't treat writers well or don't treat any. And if they're not treating writers well, you got to know not treating anybody else well.
Right. They're not treating anyone well. And I think the listeners need to know that the animation industry in particular, there are, unless you are lucky and make some special deal, which is really rare, there are no residuals. The pay is already remarkably low. It's maybe a third or a quarter the amount that someone writing a similar length script in sitcoms would get paid, and you get no residuals. So,
and that's because for very, very complex and long-term technical reasons, animation writers cannot be covered by the Writers Guild.
Right.
If we were able to join the Writers Guild and be covered and have coverage and protection under the Writers Guild, these abuses would not happen because we would have the protections of a strong union.
That's right.
But we can't I explained it in the book. I actually explained it in my book on writing for animation, comics, and games, how it happened and why it exists. And it's very frustrating, and I spent many years organizing with many other animation writers who worked even harder than I did at organizing to try to overcome this particular problem, but we could never get past the bizarre legalities of federal labor law. And, and so consequently, it still doesn't happen. And without those we got some of the worst abuses stopped just by organizing, even though we weren't an actual union. Just the fact that a lot of the animation writers got together and we came up with a code of ethics, and we stopped abuses like cattle calls and group credits and, you know, some of the worst abuses simply by organizing together.
Yeah.
You know,
I was certainly.
We don't, like you say, we don't have residuals. We don't have arbitration for credits. You know, we don't have any of these basic things you would have with the Writers Guild.
Right, and I was a part of that movement for a long time when I was still living out there. I think it's still a worthy cause, but it certainly has not been able to break down that wall except in the prime time world. And it's a shame.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
It's a shame. All right.
Because people that wrote for The Simpsons and, you know, King of the Hill and those shows, that's because most of them were actually like sitcom writers.
Right.
And when they started writing those shows, they're like, what do you mean we don't get health care? What do you mean we don't get residuals? What do you mean we don't? What? And so, you know, they organized and they got covered because they had the clout, because they weren't going to sit back and take that shit.
Right, exactly. And unfortunately, the union that oversees the writers and the artists is not terribly strong, and that's a problem compared to the Writers Guild.
And they were really developed to represent artists and not writers.
But they're
writers
not
came along much later.
But they're not strong for the artists either, which is a problem. You know, if they were strong for the artists, they'd be strong for the writers. But they get what they get, and they do the best they can. But it's unfortunate that they're not a more powerful union, considering how much money has been made in the world of animation over the last 35, 40 years. It's a huge number. All right, so I'm curious you've obviously written lots of different disciplines and in lots of different genres. Do you have one, if somebody said to you, Christy, we're going to send you to a deserted island and you're going to be forced to write something for the rest of your natural days, is there one that would stand out as the one you would want to do all the time?
Whatever it would be, it would have to be something of my own.
Okay.
See, my own original creation.
Well, that makes sense.
Like the Sisterhood of Steel or something like that, because I've reached the point in my career and in my life where I'm very, very tired of creating IP for someone else to own. I have actually turned down easily a dozen jobs in the past year.
Well, tell the listeners why. Tell the listeners what you've been through in the last year.
Yes, okay. So this is being recorded on November 8th. And exactly 1 year ago, on November 8th, Randy and I woke up and...
Was it 1 year ago today?
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
1 year ago today.
I had no idea.
I woke up, ready to take care of the cats and have breakfast. And we looked outside, and the weather was really, really strange. And we thought, this is odd. There was nothing in the weather forecast for storm clouds. And it was so weird that I actually went outside on the back deck and took video of it. And there were all these dark clouds blowing past at high speed. Very shortly after that, we got a red code evacuation alert. And we had to immediately throw all 6 of our cats into carriers, pack them into the back of our Subaru Impreza, pack up whatever we could grab, a few clothes, vital papers, some computer backups, whatever we could manage to cram into the car, and we had to evacuate. And it took 6 hours of crawling along tiny mountain roads with hundreds of other people who were trying to get away from the fire that was burning Paradise down.
Well, I was going to say, tell the listeners where this was. This is Paradise, California, right?
Paradise, California, the campfire. So we had a little bit of time because we were in Magalia, which was the next community just north of Paradise. And it was the Paradise was on fire and burning like crazy, but we didn't know that. And we would every once in a while hear like a distant muffled boom. It turned out later we found out those were propane tanks exploding.
Wow.
And so with all these hundreds and hundreds of other people were on these little tiny mountain roads creeping along to get down out of the hills and get down to safety, get down to Chico for safety. And we spent a couple of months living in hotels, and then about 6 months living in a little tiny apartment, and while we tried to get our settlement. But I mean, the agonizing part was days and days and days of watching the progress of the fire and finally discovering that our house was gone and that everything we had accumulated in our careers was gone. All of my comics, all of Peter's original art, paintings, comic art, comics that I had since I was a kid, all of my Sisterhood of Steel comics. I mean, virtually, I'd say 90% of the Sisterhood of Steel graphic novels were in my possession. They went.
Wow.
All kinds of other hundreds and hundreds of books and memorabilia and, sculpture, awards, you name it. I mean, it just turned to ash.
All your scripts. All your scripts.
So all my original scripts, which, many of them were just had been written before computer, really, or early days of computer, so they were mostly only in paper form. Some, fortunately, I had a lot of them scanned, but, I lost everything. I just lost, enormous filing cabinets full of papers and memorabilia, all the photos, of course, photos and slides, just everything you can imagine, all the original copies of games that I had, just everything you can imagine, plus all your personal stuff. Anything that my parents ever gave me is pretty much gone. And so, it's all been gone. So it took us a good 8 months to finally complete a settlement and get a new house. And we are settled in a new house. We have all 6 of our cats back with us again. They all had to stay. We got lucky. We found a a place besides the emergency shelter. We then found a place that an animal hospital that took them in for like 6 months without charging for boarding. But that was really tough too because they're our family. So yeah, so it was a year ago today that we lost everything and had to start over, and it's really it divides your life up into before the campfire and after the campfire.
Well, sure, of course it does.
Everything changes. Everything changes. Your entire life changes.
How do you think that you're doing with it? Are you doing well? I mean, you sound good.
I think we're doing well. I think we really like our new place a lot. We have an entirely different attitude about stuff, about physical and possessions. We're trying to like keep it minimal, not burden ourselves down with lots and lots and lots of physical possessions. Again, only get things that we really like or really care about or really need. You know, I'm trying to replace my comics and books and trying to replace copies of my games. You know, it's tough. It's tough getting some of this stuff.
Have people been helpful with that?
Oh yeah. Oh God, people have been tremendously helpful.
They've dug stuff out for you, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah. One friend found a pristine copy of my first Sierra Online game. I'm still trying to find the Robin Hood game, but one online comic book retailer gave me hundreds of dollars in credits so that I could replace the lost comics. I mean, you can never replace what you really had, but
right.
I can at least replace my own books.
Right.
Try to replace those as best I can. So it just you just have to cope with it. There's nothing else you can do.
Well,
I mean, what's gone is gone, and that's it's terrible, but it's not going to change anything.
No, you do have to keep moving forward with your life. You just don't stop.
Exactly.
But you now have a difference.
Sorry?
So it's now a big difference. You've had to modify how you think about life itself. Yeah,
absolutely. You know, and it's really weird because little things keep throwing you off. And like, you go to make something and you realize, oh, I don't have a vegetable peeler anymore, in the kitchen, or you're amazed at all the little things you take for granted that just aren't there, and how much you have to replace. You
got to start
really
over.
Astounding.
Yeah. Well, and we were on the verge of doing this interview like a week or two later, and obviously that didn't happen until now. So I'm kind of gobsmacked right now to realize that you tell me that today's exactly 1 year later. That's
yeah. We ruled out rebuilding because it's just so completely devastated, and there's nothing that we moved there to have is there anymore. All the big beautiful trees burned down, and the town is gone, and so we're in another nice little mountain town, and we like it. We like it a lot. So, we're settling in and we're comfortable. I am having to get my mindset back into working on the book. I'm supposed to be doing the second edition, as you mentioned, the second edition of the writing book.
Yes.
And the publisher has just been beautiful. I mean, they have not pressured me. They've been really wonderful, but I really have to get my mindset back into working on that book again and get that book done.
Okay, well, good. Bringing us back to process again. We got off track on that a little bit, but that's just such a fascinating and horrifying story, and I'm glad that you shared that with us. All right, so what do you do to stay disciplined? Do you have tricks for staying disciplined and staying on target?
No, I wish I did. I'm hopeless. My whole life I have been a terrible procrastinator, and I think it's even a Calvin and Hobbes joke, I believe, about what works the best is like last minute panic. and for much of my writing career, that was what worked best for me. Was like, oh crap, the deadline, and I would apply myself. You really do need a lot of discipline to work as a writer, and I need a lot more self-discipline than I actually have. I mean, the hardest part is just getting started. I just have to push myself to start. Once I've started, then I build up momentum and I'm fine.
So you need inertia.
Yeah. I need someone to kick me out of the inertia.
Or the other kind of inertia, which is the not doing anything inertia.
Yeah.
I have.
Well, playing World of Warcraft kind of inertia.
I have.
Randy and I like to play World of Warcraft, so it gets really easy to go off and do that instead of working.
You'll be pleased to know that I have many students who follow your line of thinking on all that. They wait till the very, very last second to do everything.
Oh God, it's terrible. It's a very, very bad habit. I do not recommend it.
I on the other hand, I can't wait like that. I can't take the pressure. So I try to get out in front of things as much as I'm able to. And when I fall a little bit behind, it freaks me out even worse. So
that's Randy. You've just described Randy.
Oh, well, there you go. There you go.
Perfect.
So there are those two sort of, very different schools of thought. I got to get it done in advance, and I'm going to wait till the last second. And I think that sort of describes a huge number of writers that I know. It's one or the other. It's not in between.
And there's also a big divide between types of writers who really like to work things out, like in detail and outline stage, before going to, say, script, or
yes,
before going to a final product.
That's me.
And that's me. But there are some writers that don't like to hate doing that. I mean, Larry DiTillio, God bless him, one of my dear friends.
What a great guy.
Worked with Larry on a lot of different things, and he got really upset with me about one script that I wrote. And I said to him, but that's how it was in the outline. I just followed the outline. I worked everything out in the outline. I followed the outline, and he was like, we're not supposed to follow outlines. He hated doing outlines. He hated outlines. He would never, if he could avoid, he would never do an outline. He just wanted to write it, and make it work. And he just thought that I was the same way, and that not that I was going to adhere to this outline, but that I was just going to write the script that he wanted me to write somehow. And so we just had two radically different approaches to how we worked, because to me it was like, no, I work all that out. I want that all worked out in outline stage, because that's how I work it out. I work it out in my head. I do 80-90% of the work in my head before I even put anything down on paper.
I agree. I think for me, that's the way to do it, because then I have a sense of security about it. If I'm just... But
everybody has a different technique.
Sure, absolutely.
I have a friend that writes beautiful novels without an outline. She just starts writing them, and she writes them, and they're beautiful and they're wonderful, and she has that process, So everybody can have a different process. It's what works for you.
No question.
However, when you're writing in a structured field, like if you're writing for a TV animation series or a TV series, you have a lot more required structure, and you have to be able to work to it. And that's probably why I am the way I am, is because I've had to do that my entire career. You're expected to do the outline, and then maybe you'll have to do a second draft of the outline. And Randy and I worked on a animated movie project with Stan Lee where I think we did 9 or 10 outlines before we even got to start on the script.
Wow. Well, your philosophy adheres to the notion of nothing focuses the mind like a tight deadline.
Yes. Well, if you're going to be a professional, you had better make your deadlines.
No question.
There's probably no single more important thing you need to be able to do as a professional writer than make your deadlines.
I think that's 100% right, because otherwise they won't hire you again. So
exactly. No matter how good you are, if you don't get the work done, you're not going to get the work.
Well, especially when you're on a TV show where there's an assembly line bit to it, where you've got to turn out one after the other in order to keep the artists moving. And
same with comics, because they're on a publisher's
sure,
schedule.
Absolutely.
And same with games, because they have very, very tough schedules, especially mobile games or something like that, where it's a much tighter turnaround. That's very important. So
we've been chatting for a little more than 70 minutes, believe that or not. And so I'm
Wow,
just,
it doesn't seem like it.
well, no, it's flown by. I'm just wondering, in all these experiences, you were maybe alluding to it earlier. Do you have a story that you can share with us that's either weird, strange, quirky, oddball, offbeat, or just plain funny?
Yeah, I don't know which of those it fits into, but I have what I call my 3 rules, Marx's 3 rules of my career that I have followed. And rule number 1 is you never know unless you try.
Okay.
Like I've been willing to try anything, any opportunity that came along. And I think the more arrows you have in your quiver as a writer, the better off you are. The more types of writing you can do, and the more different types of writing you know about, I think the better off you are, because I've been able to jump from animation to comics and games, depending on which one is hot or available at the time, that sort of thing. So willing to try anything. So that's rule number 1. Rule number 2 is the worst they can do is say no. I mean, I just have never been afraid to pitch or try or whatever. And if they say no, well, fine. You're no worse off than you were before. Rule number 3 is life is too short to work with assholes. And I'm going to tell you the story that really solidified this rule. It was a job at Hanna-Barbera, and this was before Jem came along, so it was the early 80s. And I'd been hired to develop something for a man who was quite famous at the time named Fred Silverman.
Yeah.
Fred Silverman was famous because he had been the head of all 3 of the major networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, and he, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, had something to do with creating Scooby-Doo, or he had some big credit, and so he was the person that was behind this. So I come in to have the first meeting, the introductory meeting, and it's in a big meeting room. It's so typical, you got a big meeting room, a long conference table, and you got Fred Silverman at one end, and then you've got all these other people sitting around the table. You don't know who the hell they are, producers and whatevers they are, executives of some form. I knew the one guy there that was the executive that brought me in. So Fred Silverman lays out he wants this animation series developed about stunt women, and he had all these ideas, and they're just like old rehashed ideas of stuff that's been done a million times, like got to have the funny animal sidekick, stupid shit like this. Mm-hmm. Anyway, he lays all this out, and then he goes away, and we all stand up, and they're going to take me down the hall to the office that they have for me. And they turn to me, and they turn to this other woman, and they go, oh, and the 2 of you will be working down here. And we look at each other. She looks at me, I look at her, and we're like, what? They had hired both of us to develop the series, and they had not bothered to tell either one of us that we were going to be working with another person. So we walk down the hallway, and we sit down in the chairs, and we look at each other, and we're like, well, okay. And as luck would have it, she turned out to be a wonderful, wonderful person. Her name was Misty Stewart.
Yeah.
And we hit it off great, and we ended up having a wonderful time doing this development work together. So we did our development path, wrote up the stuff we were supposed to write up, came up with some story ideas, and then we had the next big meeting with Fred Silverman. So we back in the big conference room, Silverman's down there. And so Misty went first. And we always joke that we're like the vaudeville team. Here we come, Misty and Christy. And she went first and was pitching these ideas. And there's this pause, and Fred Silverman just goes, that's shit. And Misty is like the sweetest woman. She was just devastated. And I began to vibrate with rage. And I thought, if he said one goddamn thing to me like that, I was going to rip his head off. And he must have seen it in my face or something, because he didn't actually have me do anything else. He just said, go start over again. And I went down the hall with Misty, and I said, that's it, I'm out. I am not putting up with that. I am not going to deal with that man. And that's where my 3rd rule really became put in place, cemented in place, was life is just too short to work with assholes. I called my agent, and I said, look, I've done everything that was required in my deal. That's it. I'm done. I'm not doing this.
And most of us have had some similar kind of thing happen. And it is, some people will swallow it and some people won't, and good for you for not.
Yeah, and the beauty of the thing is, too, that after I got Jim, I was able to hire Misty to come and write some Jim
That's
scripts.
great. That's wonderful.
So it all worked out very nicely.
So would you say the 3 rules would be your solid piece of advice or a tip for those that are trying to make it in the business, or do you have something further?
Well, I think those 3 rules are probably very, very good to be applied across the board. And as I recommended that as many different types of writing that you can do, as many different forms of media that you can write in, that I think that's also very beneficial. Of course, you have to be able to focused enough to be good in any one of them.
Right.
Because game writing, for example, is such a massive field at this point and there are lots of courses now for narrative design and for writing for games that never existed before. But you have to know so much about games. You have to really study up and learn not just how to play a game, but you have to learn what is the business of making games, what is the business of making comics, what is the business of making animation. I mean, you have to understand the field. So you have to understand how it works, how the field works. You have to understand the medium itself by watching, reading, listening, paying attention to it, immersing yourself in it. Obviously you have to read a lot of comics if you want to understand comics. You have to be disciplined and learn how to write to that medium, what works best for that medium. So these are all, I just think, basic important elements, and you just have to educate yourself. You really have to learn about the medium that you want to work in and do the work.
Well, I think there's no doubt that's extraordinarily wise all the way around, because I see so frequently, not just here on campus, but in the world, people don't study the market that they're trying to make a break into, and without doing that, you don't know what the heck's going on or how to talk to people or anything else. So
yeah, you don't know who to talk to. You don't know how to talk to them. You don't know how to pitch to them. You don't know whether they're the right person to pitch to. If you don't know marketplace, how do you know where to go pitch a particular thing that you want to do? Or they have unrealistic expectations, like, I'm just going to walk into Marvel Comics and pitch a brand new character, and somehow Marvel Comics is going to want to do this. No. So you have to have realistic expectations. You have to break in and work up to doing something like that.
Well, and you have to earn your way up to it, but without studying what you're going into, you can kind of forget about it, because then you're going to expose yourself to someone that doesn't understand what they're doing.
Yeah, but here's the thing: there are now so many opportunities and so many different ways for people to do their own work, to put out their own comic or their own graphic novel. It's a lot harder to put out your own game, but it's not impossible. And you could certainly do interactive fiction just by learning, a program like Twine. You can put that out. You can put out your own comics. It's a little harder, but you can do it. So there are many other opportunities out there to self-publish or self-create and put your own work out there. But if you want to work on someone else's IP, that's different. That's a different ladder to climb.
Sure.
And having your own work out there can help you maybe get on the bottom rung of that ladder and work your way up, or you could just make it on your own that way. That's also a possibility. Have been some breakout people who have done that.
Right. Well, Christy, this has been a spectacular show. You've given us so much food for thought and so many different perspectives on how to be in a career, how to work with different aspects of the industry, and I'm so pleased that finally we got you on the show, and that you're on a good path, at least back to some kind of normalcy out there in California, and I just want to thank you for coming on the show today. It's been terrific.
I'm very glad to do it, and I really enjoyed it.
And so we've come to the end of today's Story Beat. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great episodes to you. This podcast would not have been possible without the generous support of the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.